Right. Today, I want to talk about actually studying handreading. And it is something you actually do need to study. It's not something that you can just magically pick up or acquire from reading a few books or looking at a few hands. You do actually need to study, and actually really to study handreading properly, you need to study psychology, you need to study sociology, you need to understand religion, you need to look at biology and genetics. You need to understand all the different studies that have looked at human behavior and how humans motivate themselves and what human beings do. So it becomes actually an incredibly broad subject. It's useful if you can speak a couple of languages: French, German, Chinese. The more kind of academic study you've got under your belt, the better place you're going to be to do handreading. Handreading is not something that is easy to learn. It's a complicated subject. It requires a complicated thought processes. It requires a subtlety of evaluation and investigation. It requires endeavor, and it requires patience, and it requires thoroughness. And as a result of all those things, it's actually a really difficult subject to learn. And that's why there are so many terrible hand readers in the world and very few very good ones. So it's a lifetime study, really. It's not something that you're going to pick up in a short period of time. Probably the quickest time people become competent hand readers is about 2 years of assiduous study. If they've got a good tutor and they're studying courses with that person and they're looking at handprints and they've already got a university degree in something relevant like anthropology or psychology, that would all help. It takes a long time to pick this stuff up, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort on your part. And the main reason why it's such a difficult thing to do, because it's not a book-based learning, it's not an academic-based learning. Most of all, the most important thing that's required to become a decent hand reader is you actually need to develop clarity of your own self-understanding. It's an absolute truism that you will not see into the consciousness of another person. You will not be able to see into the patterns of the hand and what they signify further than you have looked into yourself. So a good meditational practice, a good amount of self-reflection and introversion and introspection is important, as well as having done some counseling or some therapy or done some work on your own psychological patterns and conditioning. That kind of goes hand in hand with doing hand reading. You can't really become a good hand reader unless you've done all of those things, because you won't have a subtlety of your own understanding of your own consciousness sufficient to be able to penetrate the veil that obscures other people's awareness of themselves. And essentially that's what we're doing in hand reading. We're using the hand as a map to navigate through the darkness of someone's soul, if you like. And we need to have done that journey ourselves before we can help other people. So it's a combination of different processes and practices. It's a combination of developing self-awareness, as well as studying and learning about the hand, as well as studying and learning about all sorts of other features of human experience within the world. Anthropology, psychology, sociology, philosophy, religion, politics, just to name a few. So if you're not daunted by that, then you're in the right place to learn how to do hand reading. That being said, obviously the place that you're going to start is in actually looking at books that are written on hand reading, and start with those. And unfortunately, there are thousands and thousands of books written on palmistry, and probably 99.5% of them are absolute rubbish, not worth the paper they're printed on, and not worth bothering with at all. I mean, I say that in all seriousness. When I was in Oxford and I was doing my compilation on the history of hand reading, I was having access to the Bodleian Library, which is a copyright library. Every book on every subject ever published in the UK has been deposited in that library, including all the books on palmistry. So I read them all. This was in 1995, so I guess there might have been a few more written since that time. But it's very rare that I come across a book that I find on handreading that I find contains any new information that hasn't been regurgitated somewhere else, or isn't just a copy of someone else's work, or isn't just a misinterpretation of someone else's work. So there are actually very, very few reliable books on handreading that that are really worthy of study. So I'm going to outline what those books are, and if you've got other people who've got other opinions about that, you can put some comments in below, and we can have a conversation about it. But there's really not a lot of really good handreading books around. A lot of it, I think, is to do with the fact that many people come up with their own kind of theories about things, and when people come up with their own theory, they're kind of basically presenting their own prejudices and predilections, and so they kind of like end up with a kind of slanted view on handreading according to whatever particular model they happen to be using. I explained just in the conversation yesterday about the different types of reading. You see that particularly in psychologistic presentations on handreading, where you get an entire theory put forward by one person, and everything is looked at in those terms without reference to anything else. So we as hand readers have a duty to our art and duty to the people whose hands we're going to read, that we have a broader range of understanding as possible, but we also have a duty and an obligation to be for that range and understanding to be accurate and precise. So when I look at the books that have been written in the past, probably the two historical texts that stand out the most are Fred Getting's The Book of the Hand, and Beryl Hutchinson, Your Life is in Your Hands. These two books, actually, I can actually share an image of those two. I'll do that right now. These two books are incredibly important because of what they contain. The significance of the books is precisely because of that. So, for example, if we look at Fred Getting's book, The Book of the Hand, the significance of that book is particularly because he is the first person to develop a comprehensive system of handshake classification, which is the 4 elements handshake classification using earth, water, fire, and air. So that's where those ideas come from. All the different attempts to classify hand shapes by other people like de Pontigny or Benham, all those kind of people, whether they use the mouth or the fingers, all have flaws in them and are difficult to work with. And whereas the hand shape classification using elements is actually the simplest: finger length and palmar shape. 2 types of shapes, square or oblong, 2 types of fingers, long or short. Therefore, you end up with 4 combinations. That's not to say that the system is without its own limitations, but it is the best of the classification systems that have been developed over the years. Gettings is clearly a historian as well. He wrote a fantastic history of palmistry, which was probably the best been written to that date, which was 1965. And he's got lots of really interesting anecdotes and insights throughout the book, and it's a really easy book to read. So The Book of the Hand, Hamlin 1965, is definitely one of my highly recommended books. The second book from that time period, which is also incredibly important, is Beryl Hutchinson's Your Life in Your Hand. This was Laura Thornton's Bible. This was the book that she studied from. She had a £50 reward for that in that book. She said, if I ever lose it and you find it, give me it back to me and I'll give you 50 quid, which is a lot of money in 1982. But yeah, it is a comprehensive, and it's a very unassuming book. It's tiny, it's badly printed, but the quantity of information in there is absolutely amazing, particularly on fingerprints and palmar dermatoglyphics. Beryl Hutchinson was a student of Noel Jaquin and the Society for the Study of Physiological Patterns, which Jaquin founded in 1945. And then she was the president of that organization for many, many years until she died in 1984. So she, and this book came out in 1967. So, and she was financially self-supported. She had inheritance, and so she was able to do all her studies without having to worry about making any money. So she's done a really good job there of summarizing the whole subject of the hand. She's very interested in anatomy and physiology of the hand and explaining it that way. She's got some very interesting handprints in the book. But as I say, probably her most significant contribution is to develop the work of Jaquin that Jaquin did on fingerprints and the psychological significance of fingerprints. And I'm indebted to her for her insights and understandings into the Palmer dermatoglyphics and their meanings and significance. So that's the second book that I recommend very, very strongly, Your Life in Your Hands by Beryl Hutchinson. In terms of more historical text, I think the other texts that are really important to look at from the 20th century are any or all of the books by Noel Jaquin, Julius Spear, and Charlotte Wolfe. These three authors are the giants of hand reading in the 20th century. Jaquin was writing from about 1926 to about 1956, and he wrote 9 or 10 books. Probably the most important of one was The Hand of Man, or The Signature of Time. He's got quite a sort of affable style. He's like being read a bedtime story by a nice uncle sometimes when you read those books. But and unfortunately, there's not an awful lot of handprints in there. But he again was an extraordinary pioneer into fingerprint patterns and the psychological significance of fingerprint patterns, and also the medical significance of dermatoglyphics and dermatoglyphic conditions. In fact, what Jaquin was writing in the 1930s was later found verified quite accidentally by medical dermatoglyphicists in the 1980s. So all the things that he was writing about, it had incredible prescience that was basically later proved by scientists who were studying medical dermatoglyphics. So his books are really important from that point of view in terms of what his insights and understandings about people based upon his observations. I mean, a lot of it is quite dated, but he stands as a giant because of his contributions in the field of dermatoglyphic dissociation and the psychological patterns of fingerprints. Julius Spear is really, really important too. He was a German psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, a student of Carl Jung. His book is really, really, really weird. It's probably one of the most unusual books on hand reading. He kind of doesn't follow anybody else's rules. He's got his whole complete way of making it up. And like he reads the hands the backwards way around. He leaves the lines the wrong way around. And as such, he's really interesting. He's also got some really good handprints in his book. And the most standout contribution that he's made to the history of hand reading, really, into the hand reading body of knowledge, is the consideration of the hand from a psychosexual developmental point of view, which of course is the provenance of psychotherapy. Which is to say, he was looking at the hand and seeing the kind of traumatic effects of childhood as they were imprinted in the hand, and looking at what kind of effects that caused in people. And so he's really the person who made the first observations about the short, low set air finger, which anyone who's a practicing hand reader will know is an incredibly potent signifier of all sorts of childhood psychological developmental issues. So he's really, really important, despite the fact he only wrote one book. And it's very weird, and you won't learn a lot of hand reading from it, but you'll understand a lot of things about hand reading from reading that book. And the same can be said also for Charlotte Wolfe, who was a medical doctor and scientist in Germany, France, and the UK in the 1930s and 1940s. She is probably the only person who's done significant studies into the psychological effects of the hand at a scientific level. She was able to have access to psychiatric institutions, and she was able to study the hands of people with various degrees of mental illness and mental ill health, like schizophrenia, hebephrenia, paraphrenia. She studied the hands of people with intellectual retardation issues, and and she also had access to, through her connections to Julian Huxley, she had access to the Royal Zoological Society in the UK, and even took the handprints of primates at London Zoo as well. So she is an extraordinary woman, and I mean, she's done enough on her own to show that there is a scientific basis to hand reading. And that's enough reason on its own to be reading her works and to be clear about what she has to say about these things. Again, a lot of the stuff in there is very dated, 1940s, 1950s. You know, you're talking, you know, there are sort of quite fixed views about genetics and things like that, which we wouldn't countenance these days. But the fact remains that she has the only one who's shown, for example, that personal psychology and endocrinological effects can be clearly indicated in the hand, and so this, and showing therefore the connection between the body and the mind, and how the hand can actually reflect the psychological patterns of human beings. So try and get hold of these books. A lot of them are really difficult. They're out of print. The Human Hand or The Hand in Psychological Diagnosis are her two most scientific works. They are really boring to read. It is full of charts and statistics and scientific jargon. So they aren't easy reads at all. But if you're serious about hand reading, then you need to get those books and read them. The lightest book, in some ways the most interesting book, is the one called Studies in Hand Reading, which she got published through connections to Aldous Huxley, who introduced her to the literary set in London and Paris in the 1930s. So she got handprints all sorts of famous people: George Bernard Shaw, Virginia Woolf, Man Ray, T.S. Eliot, who she met through her connections to Aldous Huxley. So that book is quite remarkable because it has an enormously good collection of the handprints of famous artists, musicians, and writers from those days. So yeah, try and get hold of that one if you can. So yeah, so there's out of that lot, so out of that's about 20 books on there. So that's about 5 books on there. Plus you've got Gettings, plus you've got Hutchinson. So that's, yeah, you've basically got about 7 books that you should look at from those sorts of time. And when it comes to more contemporary authors, there's only really 2 people that I think have written books that are really worthy of study. The first is the Australian palmist, Andrew Fitzherbert. Andrew and I have known each other for over 30 years. We kind of corresponded in the 1990s because we both were pursuing our studies into the histories of hand reading, and he's an absolute expert on the history of hand reading, in many ways much better, much more knowledgeable about than I am in those things, and particularly in certain aspects of it, like Victorian palmistry, because that's his interest. He's a bookbinder and he loves books, and I wanted to get, when I wrote my history, I wanted to get an overview of the history, but he loves the detail of history. So we spent about 3 years sending each other letters and texts that we'd found and corresponding in great detail about the history of hand reading. And we actually finally met each other in June of this year. We hadn't ever met each other. And I popped over to Australia in June in Brisbane and went and had a couple of afternoons talking with him, which is a fantastic thing to do. So my favourite book of his is The Palmer's Companion, but that won't appeal to most of you unless you're really interested in the history of hand reading. So his other 2 books, Hand Psychology, Career Success and Self-Fulfillment, are both really useful books. He's a very practical hand reader. He's got arches, so he wants to make sure everything works, and it's good. There's lots of practical experience, and it's accumulated over many decades, because he's been doing hand reading since the early 1970s for sure. Yeah, he was in London in 1976, which is how he knows all about the origins of the Chirological Society. But yeah, his books are really good, and they're kind of framed really kind of well. Like he's the career book. He looks like, let's look at the hands of people who are artists and see what kind of features you get in their hands. Let's look at mechanics and engineers and see what kind of hand things you get in their hands. So he's done it in that kind of way, and the same for the psychological thing. So rather than being let's go through each part of the hand, this means this and this means that, he's taken it in a more thematic kind of way, which I think is a very intelligent way of presenting the material. And if you understand elemental hand reading, if you've done hand reading with Johnny or Felicity or myself, then or anyone else who's done the elemental approach to handreading, you'll read his book and you'll go, oh, this completely makes sense, because what he's found tallies very nicely with the elemental understanding of the significance of the hand features. So I recommend all of his books. Those three are probably the standout ones. And a note on the history of handreading. Look, it's really, I kind of was slightly dismissed that you shouldn't be interested in that. Well, actually, you should. It's an irksome thing for me to discover that people still regurgitate mythological nonsense about the history of handreading, like it was studied by gypsies, or that Aristotle wrote a treatise on it and stuff like that. My own history of handreading has been online since 2001. There's absolutely no excuse for anybody to not know anything about the history of handreading, and it's freely available. It's an easy read. Just go online, just Google handreading history, or go to my website and you'll find it and read it. You really need to know the background story to this. It tells you why people think handreading is to do with prediction and fortune telling, and what was going on with that. It tells you what the connection between astrology and handreading is. And it just shows you a lot, the origins, a lot of the mythologies that we hand readers have to kind of cope with, that are still persistent even to this day. Things like the hand shows you how long you're going to live, or how you're going to die, or all this we've got to look for crosses and stars and that whole kind of signs and symbols approach to the hand, which is essentially 500 years out of date. So yeah, really good idea to study the history of handreading, so that you know the context of what we're doing in modern days. And with that in mind, it was evident to me that basically there are no useful books on handreading written before 1920. Literally nothing is of any use until we get to the modern period, when you get the start of study of dermatoglyphics in the medical field, and Noel Jaquin's work from 1920s. So please save your money and don't buy any of those Victorian palmistry books, unless you happen to be a historian or an avid collector of books. Obviously go for it in that sense. And there are a few of those which have got good handprint collections in them, but it's really not very many. So if you want to get one book to start with, I strongly recommend the Spellbinding Power of Palmistry by Johnny Fincham. Yeah, Johnny was part of the Chirological Society with me. He first studied with a guy called Dave Gillen, who was one of my students in Norwich. So I was in Norwich, as I mentioned, and I studied with Fran and Dylan Warren Davis, and then I left Norwich to go to Oxford. Before I left Oxford, I trained a guy called Dave Gillen in handreading, and he was running courses, and Johnny did a beginner's course with him, I think at the University of East Anglia, and I suspect probably in autumn of 86 or maybe early 1987. And I finally met Johnny in 1989 after I finished my degree, at a famous 2-week seminar was held in Croatia and Yugoslavia, as it was at that time. And we kind of, the rest of the say is history. I used to go to his house many times in the 1990s. I used to teach all my intermediate students through him, and that's how I met Felicity Booth, who studied. I should tell you her story about her studies, but she came to the seminars that Johnny was organising in his house that I was running on intermediate level chirology. And Johnny, as I mentioned previously, he's the only other person to have got his intermediate diploma in handreading. I think maybe Chris Swain did as well, actually. So there may be two of them. But we did a lot of studying together in the 1990s. And then, of course, we did the advanced studies research study group that we did for 3 or 4 years in the middle 1990s. So basically, yeah, Johnny studied with me, and when he came to write this book, he queried with me. He said, "Look, would it be okay to use a lot of that structure from the courses that you taught back then and put it into this book?" And I said, sure, of course, that would be great, because I know he's got a fantastic writing style, and he's got a very easy way of presenting information to people. It makes it very accessible to people, and something that I'm not particularly good at doing, because I tend to get more convoluted, and it's because of the complexities of the whole subject. But what I understand is this book is actually the least popular of all his books, and has sold the least number of copies, because people find it too complicated. But it really isn't complicated. This book is about as simple as you could get for an explanation of the basics of hand reading, and it's very comprehensive. It covers in a very short, succinct manner all the different features of the hand, and I recommend it to all my students when they do courses with me. So this book is something that you need to learn and inwardly digest. It's something you should know. You should know everything in this book from cover to cover, and if you do that, you'll kind of have a really good basis for understanding the hand. And the significance of all the other books that I've mentioned is they're all books that have had a profound influence on my development of my understanding of hand reading, which then have a profound effect upon Johnny's understanding of hand reading too. And I just watched an interview with him online with Brent Bruning, and I was just fascinated to hear, which was done about a year ago, but I was fascinated to hear Johnny talking about various hand features and going, oh yeah, you got that from Caroline Abrams. Oh yeah, that's about the minor file line. I remember telling you that. So little things like that where you can trace back the kind of origins of these ideas from discussions that he and I had in the 1990s. So it's always good to know the sources for these ideas, which is why those authors, particularly Hutchinson, Gettings, Jaquin, Spear, and Wolfe, are really, really important to read and to know about. So that's kind of what I wanted to say to you today. I'm going to put a book list in the show notes below, so you can actually get the references for all these books. I hope you don't have to write them all down. And if you apply yourself to just getting these books and just study these, you're going to save yourself an awful lot of time and save yourself an awful lot of money. Most hand readers in the world arrive at the conclusions they come at because through trial and error, through their own endeavors, because most people learn on their own, and they end up with this kind of distilled knowledge that they've accumulated through many, many years of trial and error. So give yourself a break, make it easy on yourself. You've got a lot to learn, even if you just study these dozen or so books, and you still got to go and study sociology and spirituality and psychology and metaphysics and philosophy. So you've got a lot of other things to do as well, but this should get you going. And I hope you find that useful kind of summary to which books to go ahead and purchase, which books are the most reliable. But just be assured, most of the books out there are unreliable, and even the ones that I recommended, it's still incredibly important that you do your learning from your own experience. So you need to test out all the ideas that people present to you and that you read about in books, and try it out on different people. You need to see what they're saying, and you need to see why they're saying what they're saying. And if you can do that, then you'll become a very good hand analyst. But it takes time, it takes patience, it takes dedication, and it takes study. You can't become a hand reader without doing years of studying. All right, leave your comments in below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. There'll be more content coming for you. I'm going to do a presentation on the different parts of the hand, and I'll drop those online over the course of the run up to Christmas. So and I'm looking forward to doing some interviews with people as well. So I will see you back here very soon.